to welcome back everybody to this afternoon session of the SHAPE final finale event. It's been a really fascinating couple of years, and I'm really pleased that we had such good discussions this morning already. It's planted lots of ideas and themes that we'll be exploring in more detail now in this session. I'm Sarah Cornell, and I'm at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and my role in SHAPE was to be part of and help convene the multi-stakeholder dialogues that have informed the scenario process and that hopefully will give the scenarios a rich and exciting life beyond the end of the project too. I want to introduce my colleague Merle Remy, who you'll see quite a lot. And if anything happens to my Wi-Fi connection, I'm in the Swedish countryside, she will step in and seamlessly cover anything up. And I believe we also have our other colleague, Ana Paula Aguiar, who was mostly at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, but also really bringing a really important link between the global perspectives of SHAPE and the multi-regional perspectives through some of the synergies that came out through the course of the project with other scenarios activities. Obviously, our activity in this co-creation process, the multi-stakeholder dialogues that led to co-creation of the scenarios, involved absolutely everybody else in the SHAPE project consortium. So it's also a real pleasure. We'll introduce our colleagues who are going to be commenting on our reflections and our learning experiences in this activity of SHAPE. But you'll also see several other names, and hopefully, actually, we probably should put SHAPE after our names at some point. As before, we really welcome you to post questions into the chat, and we'll try and deal with them. And as before, we've got a lot of material to wade through very fast. So I'm going to jump straight in. Does that sound sensible, Merle? Can we push the slide to say what we're going to be doing today? We've got two chunks of work that we want to do in this session. One is to look back over what we did and why we feel that it has made a research advance in the context of integrated assessment research more generally, but also how it's made an advance in the ways that we engage as an academic community, as a diverse, interdisciplinary, international academic community with real world policy processes. And because it was a co-creation process, we really want to sort of highlight the contributions that came through this dialogue process with our diverse set of stakeholders from around the world, and of course our reflections about this engagement process. One thing I should have said right at the beginning, and we will actually acknowledge our national funders at the very end of this presentation, is for those of you who've just joined this session and weren't part of the morning, SHAPE is an international research project funded under the Joint Programming Initiative for Climate. And we're very grateful for our funders and, of course, for the networking opportunities that come from JPI initiatives more generally. And it's partly in that context of the international interdisciplinary conversations that we also want to move into the second part of our agenda, which is really about how we keep this spirit of dialogue that, as was mentioned this morning, is about trust building and increasing the transparency of some of the world's most complicated research through a process of discussion. So we'll definitely have plenty of time for the open floor questions and answers that were so rich this morning too. Next slide, please, Merle. What's coming next? I've used the word already of assessment, specifically about the quantitative modeling of integrated assessment scenarios, but that whole context around integrated assessment modeling. We're interested in the stories that people tell, the ways that people use the scenarios. And of course, we're particularly interested in the ways that we go beyond, let's say, a narrow expert community to a much deeper and wider conversation across society. Integrated assessment models have got a very long history already. They've been well established for issues around, particularly for climate and let's say the techno world, energy and macroeconomic questions. And not surprisingly, given the really technical expertise of those fields of research, most of the scenarios that have been used for the big integrated assessment context were created through a process of expert design. I mean, everyone, as we mentioned this morning, is very familiar with the SRES scenarios and then the later shared socioeconomic pathways and representative concentration RCPs as well for climate change research. But really, since, in this last decade, we're beginning to realize that we need to use the quantitative predictive power of modeling, particularly through IAM modeling, in a much wider set of contexts. As Johan Rockström said this morning, when knowledge needs are really urgent, we have to be bringing it all together in new ways. And so particularly as we started to realize some of the tensions between the climate goals and the global sustainable development goals, it became really obvious that we needed to go beyond these original application contexts of IAMs and really push them to their absolute limits. And that is part of the reason we think it's so important to have multiple opportunities for stakeholder engagement. Not just so people know what the models are doing, but also so that we as the academic community can extend the model content, the model representations, and of course, the ways that the models are interpreted and applied. So it's become increasingly common, and I wanted to I already mentioned JPI climate. I mean, many funders at the moment are really focusing on this issue of co-designing scenarios of different kinds with experts beyond academia. And we've just picked out a couple that we have had some strong synergies with through SHAPE, but really highlight that this is a very rapidly growing learning community. Sometimes these projects engage with people working in actual practice, for example, Lama Klima with land management experts. Sometimes we're talking much more about educating and informing new kinds of actors, so non-state actors, project senses. And I've already mentioned Ana Paula Aguiar's work. XPath has been looking at regional dialogues, trying to say, how do we use global insights at other scales for a kind of global collective move towards sustainable development goals. And then we move to the next slide. I've already hinted that there are many opportunities that come through this process, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. In a way, this diagram represented as a kind of a flow through from the first design of a research to the final project results. And in a sense, that is our academic position. But for our research stakeholders, the people who are interested in getting involved, every one of those steps is an entry point, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. We've learnt a lot at every single one of those steps, from the design of the proposal at the very beginning through to the scenario development, modeling, analysis, and now as we start to promote the pathways themselves. That's pretty much it from me. So I think I will, I want to click on the next slide just to make sure I do hand over to Merle. As I've said, Merle Remy is our colleague at the Research Center for Sustainability. We're just becoming familiar with that name for her organization, and she'll give us an overview of the multi-stakeholder dialogue. Over to you, Merle.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, hello, welcome from my side as well. And thanks, Sarah, for the excellent introduction. Yes, I will talk for the next 10 to maybe 15 minutes and walk you through a little bit through the multi-stakeholder dialogue. What was the purpose, who was involved and when, and what conceptual tool did we actually use for the co-creation. So well, some of you who have joined or had joined this morning have already heard that we intended to co-create the SDP narratives to better represent and capture a diversity of perspectives and debates that are currently out there in the world on climate and sustainability issues. And we also wanted to start the discussion about the use of the SDPs in contexts beyond academia. And our aims were, no, it doesn't switch. Oh, here we go. So our aims were with regard to the SDP narratives to be able to better address real world complexity in the new scenarios, and then also increase transparency about the modeling choices that the translation from the qualitative narratives takes to the quantitative modeling process. How do we communicate about these things, about key assumptions, and have room for a joint and mutual learning between the modelers and our other researchers in the team and our stakeholder group. Now, who was involved and when? So I won't deep dive into this. So participants were invited from a very wide range of geographic and sectoral contexts and also scales. So we had people joining from ICLE, an international organization operating at the local scale, to national ministries and also the UN body. We had policymakers, civil society practitioners from the economy, mainly energy economy, and then also other academics joining and widening the discussion beyond the modeling community. And we did that throughout the lifetime of the project. So this is the timeline above, or on the top, you can see the main steps for the narrative development of the SDPs, and then also the steps for the quantification. And below that, you can actually see how this connects to our SHAPE stakeholder activities. And so we started in June 2020, and our last big workshop was in April, only last year. I want to highlight a few things. So the narrative creation was at the beginning of the project. We had 44 stakeholders contributing via a questionnaire, but also the first stakeholder workshop. It was important to us to also give feedback to our stakeholders about how the input was integrated, and that's where we why we also had a second webinar informing and giving room to discussions about the finalized narratives for the SDPs. We then decided that we also want to open the stakeholder dialogue again and have new and other stakeholders join in order to enable a second workshop where we really deep dive into regional perspectives on first SDP modeling results. And that's where 33 stakeholders joined us for specially dedicated regional discussions. And in total, we had a little bit more than 80 stakeholders participating in at least one SHAPE event. And that actually excludes the first webinar, because that was really for informational purposes. And some stakeholders stick with us, others decided, well, we might wait for another opportunity. So a little bit more than 80 stakeholders in the end. So how did we structure the discussions and gathered input for the narratives? So I'm here focusing on the first phase of the multi-stakeholder dialogue. And so we based our approach on the branching point approach. It's difficult to pronounce. And as we already said, it was very important to us to capture divergent perspectives and to have a diversity of narrative storylines represented by the SDPs. And so we discussed together with our stakeholders dimensions that we considered, or the stakeholder group and in discussions considered relevant for sustainable development. I'm giving here an example. It's economic paradigm growth and inequality in finance. We then deep dived and developed different options. How can this dimension develop sustainably? And we did that for 12 different dimensions here represented by the icons. And the reason I was picking, or I'm picking this particular example, is because this is also an output from the first workshop. and the stakeholder input, basically, because economic paradigm growth wasn't represented separately in an initial draft that was also provided by the research consortium to have a base for discussion with our stakeholders. And also it was proposed to include a post-growth option for economic development. And this was also integrated here in one of the options. And then also in the SDP narrative on resilient communities, as you might have heard this morning. And so the engagement formats for this part of SDP narrative development was the questionnaire and multi-day stakeholder workshop. So the approach also helped us in other ways because it allowed transparency on the narrative level. So some of the dimensions can very clearly be traced back to the models that are used in SHAPE. And at the same time, it was also possible to spell out other dimensions, such as on governance and material usage, and kind of integrate those coherently in the narratives. And this transparency then facilitated the communication about modeling choices. So that was further down in the project. So once the qualitative narratives got translated into the quantitative modeling parameters, it was easier to communicate what can be part of the modeling, what cannot be part of the modeling, as we could trace back certain dimensions and their branching options from the modeling protocol to the narratives. And yeah, we hope at least that this improved understanding about the strengths and also limitations of the modeling. And if we look ahead, we also think that since the scenarios are spelled out in these modular dimensions and options, and they are spelled out qualitatively but also quantitatively, this might make it easier for other academic communities or communities in general to engage with these scenarios. We did not only, give the opportunities for active events, we also did quite a lot of work sort of behind the scenes. So this included regular email updates to the stakeholders, quite many discussions after the stakeholder events about how to integrate the stakeholder input. Of course, I mean, you would assume we would do that. And well, we did. And we had a lot of informational material prepared for the specific events, but then we also developed 2 very short videos. I think Dorothee had shared them earlier this morning in the chat. We developed fact sheets, partly also in response to feedback from our stakeholders who were asking, well, what are key assumptions of your scenarios and how can we read about it? And yeah, these were just a few examples. And not sure about time. Yeah, I think I still got a few minutes. So I want to briefly also talk about key stakeholder contributions and give a reflection from our perspective of the dialogue organizers about the co-creation process. And so a few concrete examples of key stakeholder contributions. If we look at the SDP narratives, as I had already mentioned, I think a good example is the inclusion of a post-growth strategy. We had many refinements of the dimensions. I will give the example regarding land use, which was spelled out a little bit more beyond agriculture, so also to include forestry more holistically and yeah, expand beyond agriculture and also address aquaculture. We were encouraged to give more or to think about more surprising narratives as well. So in the morning sessions, we had 3 SDP narratives presented, but yeah, the discussion went beyond, and we also thought more deeply about two more, little bit surprising SDP narratives. We also had a 6th SDP narrative in the first place, but this was, well, considered that unrealistic that it didn't make it in the end. And that's also a result from the discussions. I also want to highlight that the discussions extended very much on diversity of norms and values. So what does it take to really govern the transitions? Well, what are roles of colonialism, for example, that was raised in the discussions. And this last point very much also reflects the panel discussion this morning. Our stakeholders made sure that we always came back to the real world application context, and by asking how can the SDP scenarios actually help decision making. Can you say something about robust strategies? What would be preferred actions? At what scale do we need to have which action, considering like national context, but also the EU context, for example, and also putting a focus on current geopolitical events and how that plays out, or how does that relate to what we find out with the SDP scenarios. I have 2 more slides, and the sun is really blinding me here. So what are the lessons learned from our perspectives? Obviously, there are many lessons learned. I have one slide on I would say, central lessons. So as Sarah had said in the beginning, the scenario process offers different starting points for dialogue between researchers and the wider community, and some phases are very suitable for active contribution, such as the narrative development, and other phases are very important for information and transparency. So how do we translate the narratives into modeling assumptions? And it's important to communicate and give room for discussion about this. Co-creation in interdisciplinary work takes time and dedication from all project participants. I think this is not a new or unique lesson learned from our project. And it is important to manage expectations from all sides. So what can the modeling do? What is expected from an application context, etc. And from our side, we found that a special work package that focuses on coordinating the co-creation process is actually very useful. And this implies working closely with communications and outreach, but yet is quite distinct from it as well. And I will close with our concluding slide. So did we achieve our co-creation aims that we spelled out nicely on the first slide? So the SDPs do capture diverse perspectives better than previous global scenarios. The stakeholder inputs were integrated in the SDP narratives. We hope to have increased transparency with regard to the modeling process. We gave opportunity for that via direct discussions, via the communication material that was developed. And we, at least for the duration of the project, we tried, or we did build up a widened community. And this also takes up on what was said this morning in the panel discussion, I think by Prabhat, the key role of trust in the communication of scientific results, and actually moving forward on the transition towards sustainable development. And by having such a dialogue, we think this could be a good way to establish communication and a wider community. And this also is reflected in the last point that I had made here on the slide, that especially the second workshop made a start at bridging the use of the SDPs and the application context. where we discussed from regional perspectives the implications of the SDPs. And with that, I would like to hand over to our guests. So we invited 4 guests who will complement our presentation and the our reflection by their short comments. And I want to briefly introduce them. So we have Eva Söbbeke joining us here from the German Central Bank, and Eva contributed to our questionnaire and participated in the webinars and the second workshop. We then also have Eric Kemp-Benedict from Stockholm Environment Institute. And he also joined, I think, both of our workshops even and the webinars. And then we have also 2 of our colleagues from the SHAPE team, Isabelle Weindl from PIC, and she is part of the modeling team, and Gabriela Iacobuta from IDOS, she is part of the governance team at SHAPE. And with that, Eva, I don't know if you're ready. I would thank you. Thank you very much, Eva. I would right away hand over to Eric, who already unmuted himself.
Thank you very much. You can see, Merle, I'm having the same issue with passive solar that you are. Yes. So yes, it was a pleasure engaging in this process. And I just wanted to highlight some of the things that Merle was discussing. Sarah, in her introductory remarks, focused, I think, quite appropriately on taking the model outputs and putting them in context. Merle kind of expanded that to talk about the flow from narrative to model more concretely. And I just want to emphasize that point because I think that it's critical. I am a modeler. That's most of what I do. And the way that I prefer to work is to go from narrative to model. And I think that this was key in this case because models literally encode structural assumptions. And Eva, I think your point was well taken about the time scales. The long time scales are about structural change and transformation. And then you need to look also at the shorter time scales, the risks along those pathways. But there are enormous possibilities when you look at structural change. And I was very pleased with the strong diversity of pathways that were identified. I don't recall which pathway was omitted, but that's actually a positive sign to me that the thinking was broad enough that it was really pushing some boundaries. And I think that that's important because we have seen an enormous variety of ways of living in the past, and we shouldn't foreclose those possibilities in the future. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Eric. I would hand over to our next discussant, Isabelle. Yeah, our colleague from the SHAPE consortium.
Yeah, good afternoon from my side. I'm Isabelle Weindl and I'm part of the PIC modeling team from SHAPE. So my perspective on the co-creation process is both influenced of being a modeler, but also by my sectoral focus on land and food systems. I appreciated a lot, both the inter as well as the transdisciplinary components of the SHAPE co-creation process, which I think and I hope improved the relevance and also the consistency of the narratives that brought a lot of input and flesh to our initial ideas. And they also improved our scenario design. And moreover, they also motivated and pushed us to help set priorities for further model improvement and yeah, kind of improving our model capabilities to be better in simulating sustainable pathways. The active exchange of different expertise, different areas of expertise provided a rich knowledge base that informed the architecture of the SDP narratives, as Merle already pointed out. Also, the fine-tuning of dimensions was really a lot of shaped by the co-creation process. And we were also kind of invited to addressing blind spots, like, for example, including fisheries and aquaculture into the land and food dimension. And it also influenced the concrete content-wise elaboration of the narrative dimensions, for example, regarding putting more weight to issues like land ownership and land access. So the dialogue served as a corrective for us modelers, and prevented us, hopefully, from thinking only as far as our models would carry us in terms of quantification. And for example, regarding the land and food dimension, and additional puzzle pieces that were brought onto the kind of stage, where social and cultural relevance of land use, power inequalities, and regional divergent preferences for specific sustainable development strategies. So from the modeling perspective, the co-creation process also meant from the very start of the process to be confronted in a constructive way with the gaps between model capacities and also the requirements of stakeholders who intend to use such scenarios in the end. And I think that was a very good process. So I very much hope that we took a step forward in narrowing the gap between models and good users, but there's still a long way to go. And I'm very thankful to everybody who has participated in the process, and that I also could take part. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much for your comment, Isabelle. I will hand over to Gabriela for our last comment, and then I will hand over to Sarah, who will moderate the discussion after that. Gabriela.
Yeah, thank you very much, Merle and Sarah, and also thanks to everyone for joining us today. I will speak now. I'll give a few perspectives from the governance team side, and I would say from our side also that the stakeholder interactions were extremely valuable in all of the stages of the scenarios and models development. So starting with the narratives and the scenarios, early on, for instance, there were discussions on the importance of considering a post-growth world, which was then taken up a bit more in through the resilient community scenarios. It also helped us to shape the role of the government in all of the three scenarios. So for instance, the government as a regulator in the economy-driven innovation, the government as a partner in resilient communities, and the government as the leader in managing the global commons. So that was very important. It was also important to reach consensus that we will be living in a polycentric world, which is reflected in the three scenarios, but in different ways. So I'll call it EI, so that's economy-driven innovation. It is driven by technology. That's the kind of the center. But there's cooperation across the world in managing global commons. We see more regional cooperation, and then in the resilient communities, this polycentricity comes through a convergence of norms and values. In terms of then also understanding the modeling results and the different regional perspectives and differences, that was highly relevant, and also something that was picked up in the models and improved on later on. Of course, these three scenarios are tendencies that we would say we would observe across the world, but each of the regions starts from kind of its own entry point, and it's more likely to see more measures that pertain to one of the scenarios rather than others. So for instance, in Latin America, due to a lack of strong trust in government and business, it is expected that the resilient communities will be more likely to succeed there. In North America, the economy-driven innovation, and in Africa and Asia, managing global commons was seen as more likely. The EU seems to have policies from across the scenarios at the moment, kind of tackling the different sides, pulling multiple levers. It was also very important to note in all of the three scenarios, we need a strong, effective state and extensive coordination and functioning institutions, which might be more achievable for developed countries, but harder for developing countries that are still developing their institutions. And also in terms of international cooperation that would be needed to achieve the scenarios. If we take the EU to achieve its carbon neutrality, it will have a high need for material flows, not only minerals, not the least minerals, and for instance, green hydrogen also. And which can also raise concerns of post-colonialism and would have to be done with great care. So overall, I would say that such an exchange between the modeling community and social science, social scientists and stakeholders, such exchanges are extremely important to shape research that is of high relevance to policy making, and also to develop scenarios and possible pathways that are more useful, highly credible, and rooted in local and social realities. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. We've got two questions that have come up, and in a way they kind of touch